Hello everyone, Alec Alger the SideQuest Gamer here, and we've finally reached 40 review videos. Thank you all so much for sticking with me this long, and let me tell you, this is not just 40 review videos. That's also 200 pages of script I've typed up, and in those scripts that's 1,000 paragraphs written and at least 5,000 words typed. Anyways, 40 review videos and a lot more to come. Take 3. So to celebrate, let's take a look at one of my favorite RPGs of all time. And yes, as cliche as it is, it's Final Fantasy VI.
Now, I know a lot of you love Final Fantasy, and even if you're not into turn-based RPG combat, you can appreciate the genius writing, the storytelling, and even the complexity of the characters. I myself am not a huge fan of turn-based RPGs, mainly because, as good as they are, they're very time-consuming and it wouldn't take much for me to lose interest. I really do like the strategic combat system in RPGs, but most RPGs usually take around a month or two for me to finish, but that's because I'm one of those people who likes to play a mix of games at once, not just one game for a certain period of time.
Now. I know a lot of you people love Final Fantasy VII to death and will probably hate me for favoring other Final Fantasies over it. Now, I can't help what I like, and as good as Final Fantasy VII is, it didn't age that well, but I'll get to that later. But I can't help what I like, and Final Fantasy VII, as good as it is, it didn't age that well.
Now, I'm not saying Final Fantasy VII is a bad game, it's just that I haven't played much of it yet, but due to the pre-rendered backgrounds and the blockish character avatars alone, it really didn't age that well. Especially when it goes from the great CG cutscenes to these blockish characters with dialogue boxes, it's not that well of a transition. I mean, it's a really good transition from 2D to 3D, but it still looks like a very early 3D game. But that's really not Final Fantasy VII's fault, it's just the PlayStation's limitations. And it's still a very good game nonetheless. Now, as for my experience with the series, it goes like this. I first played Final Fantasy VIII on a demo disc when I was like 12, but back then I didn't like RPGs as a young lad who lived and breathed action games. But now I matured, and as a 17-year-old a few years ago, I first played Final Fantasy I. Because when I was 17, I discovered these things called emulators, and I wanted to really try out these retro games I kept hearing good things about, so I checked out Final Fantasy I because I wanted more experience with the Final Fantasy games. And so I first played Final Fantasy until I got past Garland, the first boss of the game. It was the first one I truly invested my time in and got myself immersed into, but like I said, after a little while I got lost and moved on to other games like Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario World. Then I returned to the series with Final Fantasy IV for the Super Nintendo, and I played through the intro and then stopped after getting lost, but I do plan on going back to it since it's an intriguing adventure with a really compelling story, and I loved its improved combat system compared to the first Final Fantasy.
They really messed up the titles during the localizations in North America. I actually thought that Final Fantasy IV was just a 16-bit remaster of Final Fantasy II for the Famicom due to its confusing title. Because the actual Final Fantasy II and III were not released for the NES in North America for unknown reasons. So then, I decided to play a fan-translated ROM of Final Fantasy II and III on an NES emulator. And after playing 10 minutes of each game, I moved on back to Final Fantasy IV. When it comes to turn-based RPGs, I really have no focus. But luckily, each Final Fantasy game is self-contained in terms of story, and might even be in its own universe than the other entries in the series. So, if you're curious about the Final Fantasy series, start with any game, except these. Trust me, those are not for beginners in the Final Fantasy series. And I seriously advise against playing any of the spin-off games like Mystic Quest or Crystal Chronicles, until you got a taste of the real deal Final Fantasy games.
Then I played a little bit of Final Fantasy V, a fan-translated ROM, and I liked it for what it is, but I didn't get far enough to experience the brilliance of the job system I heard good things about. All I remember was finding a chocobo and then saved and quit the game. I also played a little bit of Mystic Quest since I saw that on the Wii eShop and was really curious of what it was about. I played it for a little bit and got really bored. I mean, it's not a bad game, it's just not my cup of tea. In fact, I don't really think it's anybody's cup of tea. I've heard bad reviews of it for its simplistic combat system. Then I played the 6th Final Fantasy, and the intro was so amazing. I played and got myself into it immensely, where to this day, if you ask me what characters I think of when I hear Final Fantasy, while others will say Cloud, Aerith, and Sephiroth, I'll say Celes, Locke, Kefka, Shadow, and Terra.
And you will find out why in this review.
So anyways, Final Fantasy VI was developed and published by Squaresoft, who are well known as the undisputed king of RPG developers. I'm not kidding. While they're well known for Final Fantasy, which has practically become a household name, gamers, including casuals and hardcore gamers, are aware that they also made the Dragon Warrior / Dragon Quest games as well as Kingdom Hearts. While the turn-based RPG genre was made popular by Squaresoft, they didn't invent the genre. In fact, the genre wasn't even a video game in its inception. That honor would belong to the board game Dungeons & Dragons, first released in 1977, and there were probably other games that did something like that before. Dungeons & Dragons brought in the concept of experience points and stats, as well as the use of spells and potions to increase survival and battle experience. And while Dungeons & Dragons is influential, there are factors like Arthurian legend and mythology put into place that led to the inception of Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy. The first Final Fantasy game was actually going to be the last game Squaresoft was going to make since their company was not doing too well, so they decided to get as much profits as they can and made one Final Fantasy, hence the name, and to their surprise, it sold well, like extremely well, especially in Japan. So the game saved the company and spawned 2 sequels on the Nintendo Famicom Japanese console that North America never saw the light of day until the late 90s when emulation was actually playable and fans translated pages and pages of Japanese script to some moderate success.
You gotta admit, it was kind of a stupid move on Square's part not to release Final Fantasy 2 and 3 in North America, even though the first one sold moderately well. Yet games like Dragon's Quest that didn't sell too well in North America got one sequel after another. If I could speak Japanese, I'd move to Japan and take a semester of one of their business classes to see what kind of self-destructive business practices they teach. And no, before you finish your little hate-filled comments, I'm not being racist by criticizing a common Japanese business policy. It's not just Square nowadays. Nintendo seems to follow this path. Oh, and especially Capcom. And what does Nintendo, Square, and Capcom all have in common? They're video game companies from Japan. Haha, I bet some of you are erasing those SideQuest gamers are racist comments. And that doesn't apply to all Japanese video game companies, since Konami has a pretty clean record in terms of good business decisions. But anyways, enough about Japanese companies, let's get back to the review.
So anyways, history lesson's almost done. Square decided, hey, Americans actually like RPGs. Let's release Final Fantasy IV, but market it as Final Fantasy II to avoid confusion with the Western audience. But it's probably better that way, since Final Fantasy IV is actually the first worthy sequel to the first Final Fantasy. The actual Final Fantasy II for the Famicom was universally hated for not having an experience system as a method of leveling up, but rather being either taking damage by enemies or even your allies in order to boost certain stats like defense or attack. In the actual Final Fantasy III, Also on the Famicom, while good, was wicked hard. Reports even say it's an average of a 150-hour game, and in my opinion, that's way too much time for a turn-based RPG, and I hear it's the hardest game in the series. In fact, the final dungeon is nearly impossible, because there's no save points or checkpoints. So anyways, after the success of Final Fantasy 2/4 for the Super Nintendo, Square went to make the Final Fantasy V, which was released in Japan in 1992, but again, decided not to release that game here for some reason. But now, to Final Fantasy VI, they released that as Final Fantasy III over in North America in the year of 1994 to avoid confusion with the Western audience.
Now I can finally talk about the actual game.
Final Fantasy VI was developed by Square. Who else? But because the Final Fantasy series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi couldn't be as involved with the development of this game as he was with the previous 5 entries, due to his promotion to Executive Vice President of Square, he instead did become the producer of this game, but not one of the writers. However, the concept and direction of the game was really in the hands of Yoshinori Kitse, who was in charge of the event and scenario production, and Hiroyuki Ito, who was in the charge of all the aspects of the battles that initiated throughout the game. Another interesting fact is that the development team actually contributed ideas for some of the characters. These characters would each have their own episodes in the game before they eventually all unite against a common evil I will get to later. But this idea worked really well, so not all characters had to be introduced at once. Some even show up nearly halfway through the game. So with all of these ideas, the story was written by 4 or 5 people with each contributing an important scene in the game.
Story, but to avoid any major spoilers but give you an idea of the setting and atmosphere, I'm going to break my first 30 minutes rule in favor of the first 2 hours to give you enough info to start the game and not reveal any crucial plot points, but if there are, I will leave those vague.
So basically, the premise is 1,000 years ago, there was some war that erupted where the aftermath involved magic disappearing from the world of balance, and now the world was run by technology. But basically in the present day, in the world of balance, an evil empire is hunting for magical creatures known as espers in order to harness their power for their own evil desires and control the land with magic. With the acquired espers, they somehow merged magic and technology together thanks to some of the recovered espers, and they even did experiments on their own soldiers trying to merge magic with humans to make them more powerful. Some even died in the process, but some survived it. There was one soldier in particular that used his new abilities to quickly rise through the ranks to eventually become the Emperor's second in command, and that would be the evil, ruthless Kefka.
You thought Joker was insane in the Batman comics? Well, Kefka is basically Joker with dark magic on his side.
So the Empire finds out that the neutral Narsh village, which hasn't joined the Empire, is hiding a frozen esper, and then sends a magic tech squadron of 3 to the village, one even being a magical human later known in the game as Terra. But she's under the mind control of a crown placed on her head until her squad reaches the esper. But after defeating the giant cave snail, they try to awaken the esper only for it to vaporize Biggs and Wedge and leave Terra unconscious.
And yes, that is a Star Wars joke, but Biggs' name is mistranslated as Vix in the SNES version in North America. But that was fixed in the PS1 and GBA versions of the game. It's kind of funny and ironic that Biggs and Wedge are working for the Empire rather than blowing up the Death Star. And yes, it's a really obscure Star Wars reference, but it's still kind of funny nonetheless.
After being recovered by an old man, he helps her escape from Narsh village from the pursuing villagers who think she's still part of the Empire. But she falls to the bottom of the cave and is found by a master thief known as Locke. Turns out Terra has powers like no one else, and the underground rebellion known as the Returners decide to use her to make their move against the Empire. So basically, your party journeys around the world of balance, recruiting others to your cause, including King Edgar of Figaro Castle, his long-lost brother Sabin, an experimented soldier with ice abilities named Celis, whom Locke becomes romantically interested in, and many, many others, including a jungle boy, a warrior who lost his family to Kefka's army, a mercenary, and even optional characters like Mog the Moogle, a Yeti, and even a mime. Now, most RPG stories usually involved an evil wizard who's going to take over the kingdom, and the bosses defeated were a means of progression as you gain new abilities to finally access the evil wizard's castle, with the 3 or 4 heroes you customize. So, the story was only used to open doors and bridges, and really was non-existent since early 8-bit RPGs really didn't have any character development with your party members. But unlike those RPGs, Final Fantasy VI's story complements the gameplay very well and even affects it immensely. Like for example, there comes a point where your amassed team of heroes divides into groups of 3 and do their own episodes before reuniting with each other. But you have to play all 3 of their episodes to see where they end up, and it really does take some interesting twists and turns, and even allow the main characters to communicate with each other and establish friendships like Locke and Celis, Sabin and Cian, and their young companion Gao. The main group helps the underground rebellion known as the Returners on so many missions, and even later encounter a blimp pilot named Setzer who provides the party with a fast means of transportation.
I know I left out a lot, but trust me, the story you have to experience for yourself. I dare not rob you of the many twists this game takes, it's that good. Some story changes you can even control, like whether to save a character or leave them behind.
There will even be a time in the game where something completely terrible happens, and you have to basically get your band back together. But whether you want to do that is up to you. You can go alone, getting the equipment you need, and can fight the final boss with just 3 characters, although it will be extremely difficult for you to do that. Or you can also get all of the characters back together, plus the 3 new ones you have the option to discover if, say, you're the explorative type, or you can just get the characters you want to come back and have them join you in the final battle. But the best ending involves getting all of the characters, and the ending will change depending on who you have with you at the end of the game, since the ending contains scenes of each recovered character's life after the game. But there's also characters you have the option to save or not save, and if you don't save them, they'll never come back in the game.
Anyways, we're this far in the review and I didn't even touch upon the gameplay, so let's take a look at it.
Final Fantasy VI is a turn-based RPG where the characters and enemies each take turns attacking each other or increasing their own stats. But if you're one of those who loves to take time thinking of their next move, don't. Figure out your next move quickly, since I believe ever since Final Fantasy IV, there's been a time bar that fills up, and whenever that fills up, that's when your next move is. But same goes for the enemy, so if you sit around being unsure of what to do, the enemy's move bar will fill up, and they'll hit you with an attack, which could be powerful and even deadly. So know what moves are effective before the battle so you can battle effectively and efficiently. This is called the active time battle system and has been used in later games like future Final Fantasy games and even Chrono Trigger, which was released in 1995, 1 year after Final Fantasy VI.
I actually really like this feature. It adds to the intensity of the combat, and I'm sure I'm not the only one out there who likes this over the typical turn-based gameplay.
I have to say that the active time battle system completely removes the tediosity from random battle encounters. Well, almost removes it. I mean, yes, they do happen frequently, but at least there's something to watch on screen. As fun as they are, part of the problem with early RPGs was that there was nothing going on screen. Like in the first Final Fantasy, for instance, all there was stationary pictures and your character sprites, and occasionally one of them would run up and back waving their swords, and you will see the enemy stats go down by numbers. But I gave up on the game because my brain didn't get the stimuli it needed. I will revisit it sometime, but not anytime soon. Now, it's not an outstanding criticism against the game, but it's a criticism against the genre in its early days, and I've heard people complain about that exact problem only in Earthbound, but at least Earthbound had some attack animations that were so flashy they had to tone it down on the Wii U eShop version for those struggling with epilepsy. But like I said, the active time battle system fixes that problem, making battles feel different and engaging, and thankfully has become a staple in later RPGs like Golden Sun. Also, each character has their own special abilities, like Salas has ice magic, Locke has thieving abilities where he can steal things from enemies like potions, Terra has fire magic and even a magic form, Edgar has tools like drills, Sabin has special melee combat abilities provided you press a button combination, Cyan has special sword attacks, Shadow has a mastery of weapons and even can call his dog to attack enemies, and he takes a lot of health away from them. There's just so many to list, but this doesn't make each character weaker than the other, but rather encourages you to use all of your characters when their special abilities will be most useful. Now the game, graphically speaking, I wouldn't say aged well, but aged moderately. Yes, there's pixelation with those character sprites, but when the game utilizes Mode 7 when riding the giant birds known as chocobos, or when simply piloting a blimp, you pilot it in Mode 7, which isn't exactly new to the SNES, but the way the game uses it gives it kind of a 3D illusion, kind of like oddly Super Mario Kart. The Mode 7 sections are actually very immersive. I mean, it makes you feel like you're part of the world of balance. The characters' animations are not too bad either. They give the characters personality, and even though sometimes Kefka's movement animations are quirky, they're still great nonetheless. The character sprite design is really good too. You could tell Edgar was a king, or Salas and Terra were once Imperial soldiers. The designs reflect the character's identity or former identity, and they reflect them real well, especially Shadow, since the black covers his identity and conveys a sense of mystery to him. One of the most defining features of this game is undisputedly the music. It was composed by Nobuo Uematsu, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, who has done compositions for the entire Final Fantasy series, including the tie-in movies. But for this game, he's outdone himself, especially with the overworld theme, and one of my all-time favorite video game soundtracks, Kefka's final boss theme. Never have I heard soundtrack that merged desperation, mystery, and adventure very effectively like it did in Final Fantasy VI. The soundtrack can be very haunting, but also harmonious depending on what has transpired in the game, whether it be a victory or a crippling defeat for the returners. This game's soundtrack will accompany that perfectly. Now, how well has this game aged? Well, I'll say pretty well, since even though the game is on a cartridge, the music is like MP3 quality. It's that clear and well done. The graphics, like I said, there's pixelation, but it's hardly noticeable when you get used to it. I do like the art style though, but the flatness of the mountains and towns when in Mode 7 tells you that this game was made in the 90s, which isn't really a bad thing, but it's still kind of noticeable. Not the game's fault, just the time it was in. But the story and gameplay preserve this game's age, making you want to replay it from time to time. It does get better every playthrough as you pick up more bits of the story you missed before, and you probably won't find all the optional side quests and secrets on your first playthrough, so this game has a high replay value, and I'll say that this game aged pretty well for the most part, and all generations of gamers, including casual gamers, should not miss this experience. So overall, I would give Final Fantasy VI a 98 out of 100. This is, in my opinion, the greatest RPG ever made, with Chrono Trigger being an extremely close second, maybe even a tie, but I'll get to that game later. It's only like $8 in the Wii U eShop, and I'm pretty sure it's also on the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, so buy them. In fact, $8 or $10, the game's so good you'll feel like you underpaid, like you just want to give Square $50 more. It's that good. For a used cartridge-ish for the Game Boy Advance, it's around $60 to $70, but it's worth it since you'll probably get like 50 to 70 hour gameplay, depending on if you're going after all of your party members in side quests or not.
Obviously did. Wanna know something? The inception of my channel's name, the Side Quest Gamer, actually came from me playing a side quest in Final Fantasy VI, since I was playing that game over the summer. Sure, it's not the most creative name, but it shows my completionistic attitude I have towards games. So most of the reviews on my channel come from a guy who played a lot of the game to get a good idea of what it's about.
Well, I did all the side quests and beat the Super Nintendo version of the game, but I recommend the Game Boy Advance version over the Super Nintendo since it has more side quests. My friend Ben had the Game Boy Advance version, and he's beaten the Soul Shrine twice. Ben told me that the Soul Shrine is basically a boss rush that's really hard, but he beat it since it was his favorite game of all time, and it's definitely one of mine. I do wish I had the Game Boy Advance version though, but any version of the game is a great time from start to finish to completion. And the game does reward completionists, like if you've defeated all the 8 dragons in the world of Ruin, then you would gain a new skill that's very powerful. If you hunt down and defeat the Doomgazer in the world of Ruin, you will gain an Esper, which will allow you to make your party members gain its abilities. The game also rewards the explorative types. Like in the world of Ruin, if you go on a certain island, you'll unlock a new character named Go-Go, who has the power of mimicry, which can be very useful sometimes. There's even a Lost Kingdom in this game, so be sure to check out some of the side quests whenever you can get to them, because they will reward you with really powerful items that can help you with the battle with Kefka and his army. So I highly recommend you play Final Fantasy VI any means possible. If you don't have a Wii or Wii U, get one or emulate it. There's also an Android and iOS version, but I'm not sure how good of a port that is. Should be around $10 to $15. I also think it's available on Steam, which a lot of you subscribers have when I see some of your Let's Play channels. But play it. Play Final Fantasy VI. I cannot recommend this game enough. It's that good.
Anyways, thank you so much for sticking with me for 40 review videos. It seems like yesterday I was reviewing Super Mario Bros. 2 and learning how to edit. 10 more videos till we hit 50, which I'll also be reviewing one of my favorite games on that special video. I hope you all have a great day, and remember to stay awesome, my friends. Goodbye!